Space, the final frontier. Also, another day at the office for our guest tonight. It is 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern. It must be time for Mission Log Live. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm John Champion, back at it another week. Your Star Trek pals. That's us, along with you, our Star Trek pals, doing the live thing like we do. Tonight, we have the privilege of welcoming one of those guests who truly helps us bridge science and science fiction. He's Canadian astronaut Dr. Robert Thirsk, and he has logged more days in space than anyone else from his agency. We will meet Dr. Thirsk in a moment, and that is where you come in.
Yeah, we want you to be part of this conversation, and you know how to do it. Click the Zoom meeting link or use the one tap from your smartphone, or you can call us at 669-900-6833, 669-900-6833. Then you enter the meeting code on the screen or in the description. Seriously, when is the last time you talked to somebody who had been off the planet? This is one of the things that we do here at Mission Log Live. We bring in, fun and interesting people for you to talk to. You bring your questions, you bring your comments. Earl's standing by for all of them at 669-900-6833, 669-900-6833, or you can use the one tap from your smartphone or follow the links on Facebook. One last thing, however you're finding us, be that, live right now on YouTube or Facebook, or if you're catching it later, one of those places, or the audio only production, however you're finding us, we're really glad you're here. Please do us a favor, hit like, hit share. That way more fun people like you can be in on more fun conversations like these.
Hey, and speaking of fun conversations, and speaking of you, our friends, our Star Trek pals who are watching tonight, let's say hello, shall we? There's Chris Riker welcoming, I think, all of us by saying the Tranya's chilled and we're all here. There's Joy saying, my dog is having the cutest reaction to the beeping right now. You're welcome, Joy. There's Matthew Corey. There's Scott Palm saying, hey, everybody. Everybody say hey to Scott. There's Kim. There's Scott Mays. There's Carlos. There's Barry. So all the scientists in the house tonight. There's Michael. There's Tate. There's Dave. And I love it that, so John Cooley, he chimed in early, he says, greetings, gentle beings, and welcome, Dr. Thirsk. And of course, Casey replies to that with Cooley. So everybody is there. Everybody is saying hello. And of course, you know what to do. You just click on that Zoom link if you want to join us so we can see your lovely face and you join in the conversation with the three of us, or click on that the one tap from your smartphone, or dial the number and we'll be chatting. We'll be talking. Hey, Ken, before we get to everything else, how about a little news? There was some Star Trek stuff that happened over the weekend, right?
Was there really?
I know, right? It's so strange.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, really quickly, Shannon says Canadians represent. So there you go, Shannon. That was for you and for Dr. Thirsk.
Hey, don't tell Canadians what to do, Shannon. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, right. So big stuff that came out of Comic-Con. Of course, we got a new trailer for the Picard series. We got a new trailer for Discovery Season 3. And then they dropped a surprise short track. Normally they like to build up to these things, but they just put one right out there. And then I guess the next short track is actually this week. Is that right?
Yeah, on the 15th.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's later this week. I thought it was like day after tomorrow or something.
Oh, no, you're right. I'm sorry. It is actually after. It was on the 10th, and then we'll be back on the 15th. My bad.
Okay. Yeah. Whichever. Anyway.
Yeah.
So that all happened. And of course, we had a couple of friends out there, or a few friends out there as well. At Comic-Con,
yes.
I mean.
Yeah. We did have Women at Warp, and we had Priority One on the scene doing some live reporting. So check out what they have already written. Check out Daily Star Trek News, because they covered little snippets of everything that was happening there. But here's your homework, everybody. You go watch those trailers. Go watch the 2 episodes, Q&A, and then the other one, The Trouble with Edward. Come back and join us on the 15th, and we'll talk about those. Because that was a surprise for everybody. CBS is just like, hey, boom, here's Star Trek for you. Guess what? More Star Trek next week. Boom. You weren't expecting that.
I kind of wonder if they're going to have to start doing stuff like that, because if you watch the streaming landscape at this point, we've got Disney Plus coming up in November. We've got Apple TV Plus coming up at the beginning of November. You're starting to see a bunch of other moves from a bunch of other people as well. Like Hulu just this week made it possible to actually download content to watch it later, which is amazing because
Yeah.
Hulu's been around for like 11 years. I think it was 2008, maybe 2007. So like 11 or 12 years Hulu's been out there. And now they have this neat idea that everybody else has had as well. There's starting to be so much movement in that space. I mean, on the one hand, it was surprising that CBS surprised everybody. On the other hand, they got to do something because that whole field right now is just on fire.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and as people are pointing out right now in the chat, we have those short tracks, then Picard right there on January 23rd. And then we expect maybe a little bit of a break before we're either getting Discovery or Lower Decks or some combination thereof. So there's a lot more new Star Trek coming next year than we've had in several years, because up until now, we had these kind of short seasons of Disco. 15 episodes in the first season, and then 13 in the second season. I think that's right.
Yeah, something like that.
I might be wrong, whatever. But what I'm saying is there's a lot more Trek to come. So we'll have a lot more Mission Log Live to talk live about your reactions to that. By the way, I think I opened a whole can of worms by reading the message about Canada Represent, because we've already got references to ketchup chips, happening right here. Alan saying I have honorary Canadian status. I don't even know what that is, but apparently it's a thing. So there's just a lot of Canada talk going on now. Paul says I went to Canada once, maybe twice, once for sure. So this is what's happening in the chat right now. And hey, Laura, hey, David, and hey, everybody else. So it's turned into a whole Canada thing. I don't know how that happened. We've lost control of the show, Ken.
I guess so. Really quickly, we were talking about new Star Trek, but of course you had Aaron Harvey on last week talking about really old Star Trek, talking about the animated series. That, of course, brought up last week's poll question. And then I'll go ahead and hit people to what that was. And then you can tell people about this week's question as well.
Yeah.
Last week, the question was, which Star Trek animated character would you rather see in live action Trek? The two choices were Maress and Eric's. And I cannot believe it was as close as it was. And it wasn't even that close, but I can't believe it was as close as it was. Maress, 59%, Eric's 41%.
Now, we know what the correct answer is. I mean, come on.
Oh, yeah, it's Maress. Absolutely. There still is, no question. Here's the thing. I appreciate the challenge of, like, he's got 3 legs, he's got 3 arms, he's got that weird head. Let's see how they do that. Really, though, the correct answer is Maress. And so the 59% of you, way to go. 41%, hey, maybe in season 8 of whatever they do that in. We do have a new poll question this week, John, sort of playing into our guest tonight.
Yeah, we do. So the question we posed to you, space, would you go? Well, last time I checked, 88% of you said yes, 12% of you said no. Now, as we do with the poll questions, unlike last week, we make them very difficult and vague because there's so many conditional answers around this. Although I was amused by a few that I picked out. Dave said 21st century, no, 23rd century, yes. I think we might be able to talk to our guest about that tonight. Rufus says one-way ticket. Sign him up. He is ready to go. BJ says seeing Earth from orbit is the only item on my bucket list. So overwhelmingly, people do want to go. But there are a lot of people who are like, how though? How am I going to get there? That really is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say yes. I would absolutely do that. I would absolutely do that, is what I would love to say. I wouldn't do that. I sometimes I can't get on a plane. And I don't mean I've never not gotten on a plane when I was supposed to, but sometimes I'm like, yeah, it seems kind of far. Space seems a tiny bit further. Now, if we had a space elevator, I'd be in line. I'd be mashing the button, just waiting. I might even talk to people on the way up because, it'd take a little while.
It was a long trip. Yeah,
it was a
very long trip. Hey, let's introduce our guest. Now, a funny, interesting story about this. Rewind a few months, end of May, a bunch of friends and I were on this cruise in Alaska on the Queen Elizabeth. Very exciting anyway, but as cruises do, they have special guests who come on board and give lectures and talk about their area of expertise. And I was super excited to see in the program that one of these guests is an astronaut. And I had to go see this for myself, and I had to go hear what he had to say. Well, imagine my surprise and how pleased I was that I'm sitting in on one of those lectures, and at a certain point, up comes a picture of Kirk and Spock. Yes, he references Star Trek in his lecture about life in actual space. So struck up a conversation with Dr. Thirsk after that, and absolutely had to have him on the show. Now, Dr. Robert Thirsk holds the Canadian Space Agency record for the most days spent in space. He logged over 204 days in total. He flew on Space Shuttle mission STS-78. He even wrote a couple of newspaper articles that were published while he was in orbit. He was the first Canadian astronaut to fly on a Soyuz spacecraft, and he logged 188 days on the International Space Station, one of its first long-term residents, actually. And on that, he carried a number of duties, including experiments about long-term effects of microgravity on human health. So we're going to get into a lot of really cool details. It is a distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Thirsk. Bob, welcome to the show.
Oh, John, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you and Ken this evening, and with all of your listeners as well. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are very excited to have you here. I guess the place that I want to start is actually with our poll question, because we ask people just sort of a binary yes or no, do you want to go to space? And that really does raise the question of the difficulty of getting there. It's not the easiest thing in the world, easier now maybe than it was 50 years ago, but it's still quite a challenge, and it doesn't necessarily feel accessible to everyone. Do you think that we're due for a change and what that landscape is like? Do you think that space tourism will be a thing that helps to normalize space travel for people?
Yes. Well, I was listening to your poll results, and those 12% who voted no, they would not want to go to space. I think a lot of them would probably be turned off by the fact that the ride up to space and the ride home today in the 21st century is still quite a rollicking ride. And yes, we've lost people in space before, and it's usually during ascent or during reentry. A tremendous amount of kinetic and potential energy needs to be gained in order to get into orbital flight. And then at the end of the mission, a lot of kinetic and potential energy needs to be dissipated. And that's a pretty dangerous thing to do. So the ride up and down is something you have to reckon with. If you're going to become an astronaut, you got to decide whether or not the risk of space flight is worth the benefits. For me and for all my astronaut colleagues, yes, of course it is. The opportunity to fulfill a childhood dream, the opportunity to do something that few other people have done, to go where no one has gone before.
Oh, I like the sound of that. That's good.
That's good. To work with the best organizations in the world and to work with the best people in the world. To me, that greatly offsets the risk of injury or death. And maybe one last comment to make, John, is that view out the window, it's life-changing. It's mind-bending. And, you get transfixed looking at Earth, all one, see how all the civilizations, all of the countries are actually connected. And it changes your perspective on what's really important in life. So I hope that many of us listening tonight will have the opportunity to fly in space. Yeah, I'm a strong supporter of space tourism. I don't think that we're going to change the world if we fly tens of people a year, but if we can fly tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people a year, the space perspective will have an impact on civilization and society.
Can I ask, forgive me, I'm going to be, obviously the devil's advocate, or maybe just the devil at this point, because I think this is a question that does come up for people occasionally. You've made a great case for, why it's, neat for you, being someplace that nobody has, fulfilling a dream, things like that. You must get naysayers who come up to you occasionally and say, why are we bothering going to space? What are we learning? What are we getting out of that? Why are we doing this? Pretend I'm that person, and rather than punching me, tell me what your answer would be.
Well, I heard you or John say that there's a number of Canadians that are listening tonight. The first thing is it's a moneymaker. So the Canadian government invests $350 million of taxpayer dollars a year in the space program, and our space companies get revenue typically in $4 and $5 billion a year. And that's because our country has chosen niche areas to work in, niche areas that bring benefit to citizens: telecommunications, remote sensing, and then robotics, of course. So number one, it's a no-brainer. We make money doing it. But we've adapted the robot arm. We contributed the robot arm to the space shuttle and also to the International Space Station. We've taken the control algorithms off the arm, some of the gearing technology, the haptics, which is mean like the force moment feedback that the operator gets in their hand controllers, and the vision system. And we've created surgical robots for it now. So these surgical robots are saving people's lives. When I was in space, we were able to crystallize protein crystals of what's called hematopoietic prostaglandin D synthase, which means nothing to you, but it's the protein that you find in the muscle fibers of young boys who suffer from Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And scientists now have created an inhibitor of that protein, and it's in clinical trials. So perhaps the second mission that I flew on could potentially bring a solution to this terrible disease that afflicts young people. And then I'd say that we inspire the population. When I grew up in a magical time, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. That's when society was really moving fast in all areas: civil rights, entertainment, education, but also in science and tech as well. And after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, there's a saying that if we can put a man on the moon, then why can't we fill in the blank? And so why can't we address universal health care? Why can't we deal with pension reform, things like that? And I think that the Apollo mission, perhaps the most important outcome of the Apollo missions, was that it inspired society that if we focus our efforts, if we collaborate across disciplines, if we invest the resources, humanity, number one, can leave planet Earth, and number two, we can tackle some of these tough social problems. And then the last thing I would say is that I was inspired by the Apollo astronauts, by the Russian cosmonauts back then, and I was inspired to pursue an educational path that eventually led to a very satisfying career. And there's hundreds of thousands of other young people like me as well that did that as well. So I think I contribute to the innovation and the science culture in my country, and that's directly a result of the space program.
See, it's interesting that you would use that line. If we can put a man on the moon, because my mother used to say that as well. She would say, if we can put a man on the moon, why not all of them? That was her thing. I want to go back to something you mentioned about sort of the medical end and the impact on the human body of going into space, particularly for long-term space flight, because I know that that's something you're working on now, and I do want to talk about that. And that was actually some of the questions that came in. Chris in the chat says, any deleterious effects, eyes, bones, and then Joy follows up saying, wow, how was the recovery after all those days in space? So if you could talk a little bit about your own experience and then kind of lead that into what your experiments were like in space and how that's led you to what you're doing now.
Well, space is a different environment in which to live. And the three major factors that affect human physiology would be ionizing radiation. We're exposed to higher fluxes of ionizing radiation in low Earth orbit and then in deep space when someday we go to Mars. Secondly, weightlessness, which probably affects every single organ system in the body to a large or a small degree. But the organ systems we're most concerned about are the heart and the blood vessels, muscles, and the bones. And so we have to come up with countermeasures that prevent the body from atrophying away. And then the third issue, especially for long duration space flight, would be the isolation and confinement. Living aboard a spacecraft is not like a cruise aboard the Queen Elizabeth ship. It's a little bit more rustic than that. And you're
fewer waiters,
from family.
A lot fewer waiters.
Yeah. Separated from family and friends and loved ones, and that can take a psychosocial toll on you as well. Most of the effects of weightlessness on the body, atrophy of the heart, atrophy of the muscles, decalcification of the bones, that's reversible to a large extent. when you get back home. Sometimes it takes several months to regain the muscle mass you lost or to regain the calcium that you've lost, but largely it's reversible. Ionizing radiation effects are not. It's cumulative. So I've been subjected to more ionizing radiation than you have, John, and therefore I'm at risk of certain things such as cataracts, changes to my genetic organs, and then also cancer. So cancers like thyroid cancer, bone cancers like leukemia, lymphoma, I need to be checked every year to make sure that these nasty things are not there. The chance of me getting anything like that are extremely small, but it's still important to monitor that. Your listener asked about vision as well.
Yeah.
Vision can be affected. I was one of the first astronauts who was affected by vision. I noticed after about a month in space that my near vision was going away. I had trouble focusing cameras on near objects, and I had difficulty reading some of the documents that were sent up to us by mission control. They sent them up with 8 font, very small font. And
wow.
So we realized another crew member, one of my crewmates, was also affected by this visual loss. And we eventually did ultrasounds on our eyeballs and saw some swelling in the back of our eyeballs. And then we did fundoscopy. We took pictures of the back of our eyeballs, and we saw something called papilledema, which is kind of scary. It often indicates that your intracranial pressure is elevated. When we got back home after the mission, we had some MRIs or images done of our eyes, and we could see that the eyeball, which is normally spherical, was actually flattened on one end. And that explained why the focal length was different in the eyeball and why we became hyperopic. Most of us have regained, after several months, several years, we've regained our normal vision once we got back home. Not everyone has. So that's still a concern.
I'm curious because the work that you're doing now, as far as deep space exploration, is that about proximity, or is that about time spent in space? Because then what I'm thinking about is you as an astronaut, you're already a part of a pretty small group, but then as much time as you've had in space, I mean, that's not like I'm thinking about. I can't remember. It was Mark Kelly who spent as much time in space as he did, or was it Scott? I can't remember.
Scott.
Scott.
Okay,
Scott.
so I mean, so I heard your numbers and I immediately thought of Scott Kelly, and then after that, I don't like. Is there somebody who's like, oh man, I had 186 days? If I had just or are you pretty far removed, or are you and Scott Kelly pretty far removed from the amount of time that other people have stayed up?
Well, even before the era of the International Space Station, there was a Russian space station called Mir, and a Russian doctor named Polyakov. Dr. Polyakov spent just over 400 days in one flight in space. So he holds the world record. I have some Russian colleagues who are friends that over a number of missions have spent 850, 900 days total in space. But that's over 4 or 5 missions or so. But Ken, you're asking about deep space. The medical issues of deep space are going to be larger, more severe than what they are aboard the International Space Station or during a short duration flight. It's no longer going to be isolation confinement. It's going to be extreme isolation and confinement. Even higher doses of ionizing radiation, and then also a concern about how do we deliver healthcare to people in deep space. So Ken, for example, if you're on Mars right now, and I'm at mission control in Houston, and in the morning I get up and I say, good morning, Ken. It's going to take you 20 minutes to hear me say good morning. And it's going to take another 20 minutes for me to hear your good morning back. So that's one issue. But say you're calling the ground to say, my astronaut friend, John, has just had a cardiac arrhythmia. Can you help me? Well, it's going to take me 20 minutes on the ground to even hear your call for help. So healthcare delivery is going to be different. It has to be more autonomous. You are going to have to be responsible for taking care of your crewmates. You can't depend on the Earth, and you're going to rely on autonomous systems, or AI, artificial intelligence systems. you're going to laugh when I say this, but one of my favorite movies when I was young was 2001: A Space Odyssey. And the intelligence aboard that spacecraft, I think it's called Discovery, heading off to Jupiter, was HAL 9000. And Hal got involved in some drama in that movie, but Hal was responsible for operating the spacecraft and actually for the life support system. There were several crew members that were in hibernation, and that's what we're going to need for Mars. We're going to need an R2D2 or a C3PO to help us out to take care of these medical emergencies as they come up. So we're right now starting to consider what are some of the technologies, the virtual care technologies that we're going to need to deliver healthcare. And I think when I say autonomous, I think we're going to need AI to help us out. But number two, I think we're going to have to have mandatory to have a crew member who's a medical doctor aboard that space flight. Right now, that's not the case. Once in a while, there is a medical doctor that's part of the crew of the ISS. Most of the time, there's not. And that's okay, because you can get a sick crew member from the space station down to Earth in 1 or 2 days. You can do that, but you can't do that on Mars. Once you've headed off to Mars, you're committed for 2.5 years. And so I really think a specially trained medical doctor must be a member of the Mars exploration crew.
Hey, we have some amazing questions coming into the chat right now. Kenneth, Chris, Scott, I see all of them, but we do have a couple of callers standing by who want to go to first. We have Scott, who is waiting patiently. Scott, are you there?
I am there, Ken and John. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you? Welcome to the show, and welcome to meeting Dr. Thirsk. What's on your mind tonight?
Mine is a two-part question. By the way, John and Ken, you're doing an awesome job still. May I give you kudos?
Oh, thank you. It's very kind of you to say.
I missed you, Ken. My question is it's a two-parter for Dr. Thirsk. I want to say, other than John and Ken's job, I am so jealous of yours and envious. It's a wonderful thing that you get to do. My question is, I guess, a two-parter, but do you think with the knowledge that you have that making it to Mars is going to be a viable thing by around 2030 as they project? And in a Star Trek-ish B part, do you think that living and working in space as they portray on the shows, do you think with our technology, really seriously, would that ever be a feasible thing? You were already explaining some of it with the gravity mountain that we'd have to overcome and the effects on the body, but do you think that would ever be a feasible thing as they portray on the show? Would we ever get there, in your opinion?
Thanks, Scott. First of all, to Scott and all the listeners, please call me Bob or Dr. Bob. You're all considered friends now, so Bob. I think that someday we will see spaceflight as portrayed in Star Trek. So think of some of the technologies that we saw on the original Star Trek show. We saw tricorder, Dr. McCoy's tricorder, where he diagnoses and treats illness. That exists today. There's just recently a Qualcomm X Prize, $10 million X Prize that was won by a company, but there's 10 other companies that also developed a tricorder. The food replicator exists in NASA laboratories right now. The pad that Captain Kirk used to issue notes, it's an iPad today. Voice recognition exists today. So 23rd technologies that were portrayed in Star Trek are coming into existence today in the 21st century. There's a few other things that were portrayed in Star Trek that I don't think we're going to see in the near future. Teleportation, I don't know how that's actually going to work. That's beyond me. And warp drive, I don't understand how that would work. We may not see that. But Scott, maybe not for you, but maybe for your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, I think that space flight will be as routine as taking an airplane flight today. And that means flights to the moon, flights to Mars. We need better rocket technology. I don't think chemical rockets are going to be useful, for your grandchildren. But I think that we're going to be an extraplanetary civilization before the turn of the century. Mars in 2030. Wow. I would say maybe by 2035, but we need to overcome some hurdles. Number one, the medical issues that I briefly mentioned, leadership issues. We need to have a political leader out there who inspires us all that this is a worthwhile endeavor. And then thirdly, I think we need countries to come together. There is no single country in the world, not the United States, not China, that can do this alone. It has to be a world effort. And each country can contribute their funding and contribute their industrial expertise. But yeah, 2035, I think it's realistic. 2030 might be pushing it a little bit.
Cool.
Thank you very
Scott,
much.
thank you so much for calling in tonight. Really appreciate it. And till next time, okay?
Okay.
All right.
669-900-6833 is the phone number to call. 669-900-6833. Or you can use the one tap from your smartphone, or if you're on Facebook, follow the links there. You get to talk to Earl, and then you get to talk to Bob. And you also have to talk to me and John. We do have Craig coming up in just a moment, but it's the bottom of the hour, John, and that's usually time to do something.
Yeah, and I came up with something to do. Well, last week I came up with something to do. Tonight's just the follow-up to last week, something to do. Last week, of course, we had Aaron and Rich on talking about their new book. I'm going to hold it up again, Star Trek, the official guide to the animated series. And it's amazing. And their publisher, Weldon Owen, was so cool to give us some copies to give away. So the first copy that we're going to give away, we announced it last week. And you wrote in, you tagged us, you tagged Weldon Owen, and you answered the trivia question. Well, the trivia question should have been pretty easy for you all. It was the Rhet Law. What is the Rhet Law named after? Ken, you weren't here last week. What was the Rhet Law named after?
Well, first of all, I have been reading Twitter. I didn't. In fact, what's funny is I haven't listened to last week's show, but I'm like, why is everybody answering this question? We all know the reason. It's because Walter Koenig got his first writing credit, writing the Infinite Vulcan, and he named the plant after his name, but just backwards.
Yes, right? Perfect. Yeah. That's exactly it. Well, you all did what I asked you to do, which is you wrote into the show, you named the book, you named the publishing company, you tagged us, you tagged Roddenberry. Good job. And then I have 3 witnesses here on the air with me who know what I did. I picked up my phone, I asked Siri to pick a random number, and the number it landed on, that belonged to entry number 4, and that was Patrick Lindsay, and he is at, I'm going to get this wrong either way, it's either at Mac Bass, if he loves fish, or it's at Mac Bass, if he loves a funky bass line. So whichever it is, Patrick, either way, I think we can agree those are both great things. You get in touch with me, I'll get in touch with you, and you will get your very own signed copy of Star Trek, the official guide to the animated series. So good job, Patrick.
And no, that is not my copy that you're giving away, is it?
Sorry, because they were here, you weren't.
I know. Yeah, it's cool. Like, I mean, I knew the answer to the trivia question.
Okay, you say that.
Yeah, well,
you say it now,
dude. You remember
later?
Me oh, please, I was going to dress as a Felosian. That's right. I said Felosian.
Yeah, you did. You did right here in front of everybody. Yeah.
Hopefully that won't get bleeped. 669-900-6833 is the phone number to call. 669-900-6833, or you can use the one tap from your smartphone, or follow the links on Facebook, and you'll be on with Bob and us. Craig did one of those things. I think he called the number. Craig, good evening.
Good evening, gentlemen. Ditto said about John and Ken doing great work. And hello, Dr. Bob. As far as transportation, we just need a Heisenberg compensator to correct that random matter placement. But anyway, the question was the long-term effects. My original question was the long-term effects specifically on the brain, because I read an article a while ago covering on it, the long-term effects of that. And then, you being a part of that, study, I don't know if you want to expand on that, but one other thing, just as far as Aaron Eisenberg, he used to be my Sifu in Kung Fu in Simi Valley. And no one knew who he was in class. I knew, but, we never talked about it. Kind of taught me about a saying, a Taoist saying, when one's name is becoming distinguished, to fade into obscurity is the way of heaven. I just miss him, and was able to see him in Las Vegas, which was great, and hang out with him. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, we definitely miss Aaron, and it's tough. It was really heartening to see all the outpouring of gratitude and celebration of Aaron. So that's nice to hear that you got to spend some time with him. We'll kick it over to Bob then to answer the question about long-term effects of space travel on the brain, and whether there's some specific concerns there. I don't know, Craig, if there was anything in particular in this article that you read that you.
No, I was going to bring that up, but I just wanted, he really expanded way beyond what I had imagined. So I don't know if he can add anything. I can't add anything, but because his knowledge is like way beyond mine right now. Sure. But have a great evening, gentlemen, and love the show.
Thank you, Craig. Till next time.
Yeah, so Craig, I think that, as I mentioned, weightlessness affects the functioning of every single organ system in the body, including the brain. The vestibular apparatus, which is just at the base of your brain, is a classic example. It basically goes on vacation for 6 months that you're aboard the International Space Station. It can cause difficulties with balance and orientation, and when you're on orbit, with motion sickness. And similarly, when you get back home, you can be motion sick for the first few days as well. I did not participate as a subject in a long-term investigation of brain function, but I did participate in a short duration experiment. Anecdotally, astronauts who flew before me talked about something called the space stupids, which means that your cognitive function is perceived to be less sharp in space than it is on Earth. We never documented that, but we just had several astronauts coming back who said, I just didn't feel mentally sharp up there, and therefore I really relied upon checklists an awful lot. Whenever I did even simple tasks, I relied on checklists to make sure that I didn't make an error. So I participated along with some of my crewmates in a sophisticated neuroscience study to look at cognitive function in space. Basically, to make a long story short, we wired up our head with like a 64-channel EEG, looking at our brain waves and looking at other physiological signals as well, and then played video games for about an hour and 10 minutes. I'm exaggerating when I say that, but they gave us challenging spatial control tasks to do, memory tasks to do, orientation tasks to do, and just evaluated any changes in our cognitive function over the 6 months that we were in space. My understanding, after having the investigators looking at several of us astronauts in space, that they could not document any significant change in cognitive function. So that's the good news. As I mentioned earlier, there's still an effect of ionizing radiation on astronauts who spend a long period of time in space. And yeah, ionizing radiation we know can affect neurons. So we'll see what happens in the years to come, the decades to come, amongst astronauts who spent long periods of time in space. Hopefully it's minimal.
One of the other, we're getting so many questions here, which are awesome. David said, now earlier you had talked about different types of space vehicles, and you talk about moving away from chemical rockets. I know your specialty is not necessarily rocketry, but I'm curious if there are any emerging or future technologies that you think we should keep our eyes on. David mentions, is reading about plasma propulsion. Somebody mentioned ion thrust propulsion. Where do you think maybe this is heading?
Yes. So in those two areas that you just mentioned, plasma engines, ion thrusters, and also solar sails, John. There's a space probe in space right now with a large solar sail, very lightweight. It might be made of mylar or something even lighter weight than that. And there is a wind, photon wind up there in space. And the thrust is extremely low because the mass of these photons is so low that it takes a long, long time for these spacecraft with the sails to accelerate. But they can get up to very high speeds as well. So that's one area that we'll probably see get developed for long duration flights in the years to come, solar sails. Ion thrusters, same thing. They have very low thrust levels. You're not going to accelerate to high speeds quickly, but over a long period of time, you can really pick up some incredible speed. So, for example, you could use a plasma engine to launch yourself from Earth halfway to Mars, then turn your vehicle around backwards and then decelerate back down to Mars. That's another possibility. And then to get to orbital flight, Earth orbit, then I think we're probably going to see space elevators in the next, 100 years or so. Space elevators basically means that you have a satellite up in Earth orbit with a long cable that comes down into the lower atmosphere. You then fly up to the cable, attach yourself to it, and then an elevator takes you up the cable up into orbit. The problem there is the strength of the cable. The materials that we have right now to build cables cannot support their own weight when you talk about cables that are 100 miles long. So we have to do some materials engineering there before we're ready for space elevators. But again, I'm an optimist. I think in 100 years we'll be getting into space via space elevators.
669-900-6833 is the phone number to call. 669-900-6833, or you can use the one tap from your smartphone, or if you're on Facebook, follow the links there, and you'll be on with Bob. I have a question, and this is it's not completely off the science thing, but it is. We had Dr. Robert Hurt on a couple of weeks ago. He basically deals with taking the data that we get from satellites of far space, objects and nebula and other stars and things like that. And he turns them into things that we can see. And I mean, that we can understand, that the average guy, looking on CNET's like, wow, look at that. That's a Horsehead Nebula right there, or, whatever the thing is. There were a lot of things that he got sort of hung up on. There were some movies that he sees, and he's like, the science in this just takes me so far out of it. Other movies that he thought the science hit pretty well. I guess I have a couple of questions. You mentioned 2001, which of course is that's one of the movies that I think we all sort of acknowledge seems to have gotten a lot right, including the fact that there's no sound, and there are long periods where almost nothing seems to happen. But I'm wondering, like, you see something like Ad Astra, or you see something like Interstellar. Do you see, well, this is all wrong, and they're getting it wrong, and they're doing a disservice? Or do you see, look at that, there's Brad Pitt looking like an astronaut. Maybe that's going to get somebody interested in actual space. The way things are presented today, do you feel like the movies and TV, are they doing good for science, or are they doing bad for science, or is it just a wash? The people who are going to be into science are going to be into science. The people who are going to be into movies are going to be into movies.
Well, of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on which movie you're seeing, Ken. But I'm the kind of person, I go to all these movies, and I go with friends, and most of my friends they're just continually pointing out all the things that are wrong, scientifically or technically wrong with the movie. I don't do that. I go to a movie and I say, they got this right, they got that right, they got that right. So a classic example would be The Martian with Matt Damon. So a lot of the technologies that you saw in that movie, the rover vehicle that exists today. You can go, if you go down to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, you'll see it there. It's there. It's running around the campus. It's there. The use of RTG, nuclear power plants, that exists today. The habitats, the spacesuit is in development at MIT and Boston right now. Even Matt Damon is growing crops in his habitat, if you remember the movie as well. That technology also exists, is being developed in NASA Ames at the Kennedy Space Center, and also at the University of Guelph in Canada. So a lot of the technologies in The Martian, thank God for Andrew Weir, the author, and for Ridley Scott, the movie director, who consulted with experts and not only presented a wonderful drama, a wonderful story that engaged us, but got a lot of it right. Now, there's some things that they got wrong. At the end of the movie, Matt Damon removes his glove and gets a little bit extra propulsion from the pressure in his spacesuit. That's never going to happen. Similar to the movie Gravity, there's a few things that's wrong about gravity. Some of the orbital mechanics that we saw there. the orbital debris that was depicted. That's wrong. But the inside of the space station, the inside of the Soyuz vehicle, it looked pretty much like the real vehicle. So kudos to those folks for getting it right. And so I agree with you, Ken. I think that by and large, the science fiction movies today play a role, like the Apollo missions in the 60s and 70s, of capturing young people's attention. And there's something about the space theme, this appeal to our DNA of the idea of discovery and exploration that captures our attention. And I think overall, the science fiction movies, even though they may not be 100% accurate, have a positive effect on today's generation to inspire us and help us to dream of what could be.
So, I know, go ahead, Ken.
Well,
sorry.
Forgive me, John, really quickly, because I know John actually has important questions to ask. But while I've got you on pop culture, Major Tom, Rocket Man, Space Oddity, Starman, I'm curious, do you have a favorite space song? And feel free, doesn't have to be one of those four. If there's one that I forgot, because people don't come up to me all the time and start singing space songs at me. I don't know if they do to you. But do you have a favorite, in keeping with sort of the pop culture theme, do you have a favorite? I'm curious what your favorite space song is.
So I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. So that's, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Guess Who. But as I get older, my preference for music is actually sliding backwards to the left there. So I like some of the crooning music. So Fly Me to the Moon is my favorite. I also like Night and Day, which you probably never heard of. I think it might be a Cole Porter.
It is a Cole Porter song.
I like jazz, and those kinds of songs. They put an image in my brain of like Van Gogh's Starry Night, So those are my favorite songs. Anything that's got reference to the moon, the sun, or stars, I'm a sucker for those.
Nice. Well, I wasn't going to be too serious, but since we were talking about science fiction, I wanted to, since we are a Star Trek show, ostensibly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the messages that you included in your lectures, because that's what just absolutely thrilled me when I saw the talk that you gave, is that you were addressing topics of leadership and cooperation, and using Star Trek as an example of how you worked on the ISS. And I'm just curious if you can share a little bit of that with us and with our audience on what it is, what are the lessons from Star Trek that you thought, hey, I'm actually living this, or we need to get better at this.
So, when you think about the right stuff, or the skills and aptitudes that astronauts need to have in order to work well in space, I think first of all, what comes to your mind is skills in spacewalking, or in rendezvous, or in robotics, or in assembly work, And certainly we need to have those skills. But as I get older, I think that what's really important is to also have the soft skills, the personal skills, the non-technical skills. And the ones that are really important to astronauts are self-care and self-management, teamwork, group living, followership, leadership, cross-cultural skills as well, in addition to decisiveness and vision and things like that. And these skills are so important that we actually select astronauts for long-duration spaceflight according to what I just said, some of the attributes that I just said, but we also train for it as well. So after we become astronauts, once we're assigned to a crew, we'll go out into the wilderness, into the canyon lands, or in the cold mountains of Wyoming, where we don't have enough food, don't have enough water, where the temperature is ridiculously cold, for a week or two at a time, and we become accustomed to identify what our weaknesses are, our personal weaknesses are. I might become grumpy, when I'm cold, and I'm not a really good team member when I'm hungry. But we also begin to understand the strengths and weaknesses of our colleagues as well. So I think, John, what you're referring to is a slide that I showed during one of my recent talks, where I was talking about followership and leadership. Mm-hmm. And I know quite a few real life leaders who are out there. Winston Churchill, Barack Obama, and other folks like that were strong leaders. But on that slide, I showed, I think, Captain Kirk, Spock,
right.
and might have been Dr. McCoy as well.
Yeah.
I did that for two reasons. Number one, to introduce the topic of leadership, and to talk a little bit about the style of leadership that astronauts use in space. And then also the importance of followership. I find that we spend so much time talking about leadership that, most of us are not leaders. Most of us are followers. And you got to be a really good follower if you're going to be a good member of a space crew. Followership is not sitting back and waiting for the commander to, say, Bob, change out the toilet canister. No, I proactively look for those tasks that enhance the mission objectives, or something that the commander I know the next day is going to ask me to do. Well, as a follower, I'll just try to anticipate it and get it done right away. So followership is actually active. It's positive. And Spock, I think, is one of a classic example, an exemplary example of a good follower. He made Captain Kirk look good, and Kirk depended on Scotty, and depended on McCoy as well. To look good and accomplish the mission objectives. And then, the other thing about leadership, as I mentioned, is that leadership is not always directive. It's not always, hey, do this, do that. In an emergency situation aboard a spacecraft, leadership is directive. It has to be, because we have to move quickly in order to save our lives. So if there's a fire aboard the space station, our commander, Gennady, will say, Bob, get on the communication to mission control. Frank, grab a fire extinguisher. Nicole, grab some face masks. Mike, let's go forward with the procedures. We're going to look for the fire. You got to move quickly. So that's about the only time where a crew commander or a leader will be directive. Otherwise, we'll have time as a crew to discuss the issue, and by consultation or by consensus, we will, as a crew, come together with helping the leader make the correct decision. You can do that, when you got a crew of a bunch of strong leaders, and only one person is playing the role of leader. So, and I think if you look at a lot of the episodes, a lot of the movies of Kirk and Picard, I think you will see that they take on the same kind of leadership role as well. There's not one style of leadership that Picard exemplified. He made good use of his crewmates to try to come up with a consensus and consult or delegate leadership. So those Star Trek characters are good exemplary role models for us. It sounds funny, but they are.
Not to us and not to our audience. That's for sure.
669-900-6833 is the phone number to call. We got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So if you have a question for Bob, or just pop them up in Facebook, because while my eyesight is horrible, John can read those and he'll pass them along as well. Really quickly, before we get back to questions, I want to remind you about some of the other podcasts that you can check out on the Roddenberry Podcast Network. Shows like, Mission Log, for example. Maybe you heard of that one. Priority One, Women at Warp, The Trek Files, Daily Star Trek News, and Shabam. I think they're coming close to the end of their first season, or I think we're coming close to the end of their first season. I'm not sure. But the cool thing is it's all out there. So if you've missed it to this point, don't think, there's no point. No, it's all there. And you can find it all at one place, podcast.roddenberry.com, or look for all of those shows wherever you get your podcasts. 669-900-6833 is the phone number to call, 669-900-6833, or use the one tap from your smartphone, or follow the links on Facebook. John, again, my eyes, I apologize.
No. Here's a quick fun one. Dave Taylor asked, what crew would you actually want to serve with? I mean, you mentioned Kirk, you mentioned Picard, both leaders, both different leadership styles, but a lot of the same positive qualities. Who would you rather serve with?
Wow. I think Picard, because I'd probably more like Picard in style and in temperament. But if I want to have a good time, I think I'd go with Kirk. So
yeah, That's very similar to an answer I gave on this very show. So
oh, really?
I totally agree with you. Yeah, right. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier in the show. You talked about how for so many, maybe all of the people that you've talked to who have had a similar experience to yours, gone into space, either on a shuttle mission or spent time at the ISS, that there is a transcendent moment. There is an experience where you see the Earth and it starts to become something very different in your eyes, because you see the countries that sort of blend together into land masses without borders. It changes your perspective of what humanity and what sort of our place in the universe is. I mean, first of all, I'm interested that you had time to be reflective, and I'm interested if there was, did that feeling wear off, or was there more than one of those experiences, the days and days and days that you were there? And did you bring a piece of that back with you when you came back to Earth?
I remember my first view out the window as a rookie astronaut. It was aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. We just launched. About 10 minutes into the flight, I was busy, trying to help reconfigure the shuttle from being a launch vehicle to being an orbiting laboratory. And someone tapped me on the shoulder and they said, "Bob, look." And there's a window there the entire time. And I looked out the window, and it was a view of the Atlantic Ocean. And the sun was glinting off the ocean. Beyond the ocean was the curvature of the Earth's horizon. And then beyond the Earth's horizon was nothing but inky black space. And this chill went down my spine because, number one, I just realized a childhood dream that, of flying in space. But also I saw Earth for the first time as just a body out there in the vast expanse of nothingness. And so that makes an impression on you, and you see Earth as a vulnerable, fragile body out there. So, I live in Ottawa. So today it was a beautiful day here. It was absolutely blue sky the entire day. And, you look up and you see nothing but blue sky. And I could be forgiven if I would think of we have one plentiful resource on Earth. It's our atmosphere. And it's not true. Up in space, you see how little atmosphere that we have that, separates us from the vacuum of space, the extreme temperatures of space, the ionizing radiation of space. And it's just, so if you're to model the Earth as a basketball, the size of the Earth is a basketball, all the atmosphere that we have that's keeping us alive is like one wrap of tissue around that basketball. And often I would be up there on the space station window and imagine a giant coming by and going and blowing away all our atmosphere. Life would cease to exist. It's that razor thin. It made me appreciate how darn lucky we are to be alive on this planet. It's not a whole lot of atmosphere or water that's keeping us alive. It's changed me permanently. A few minutes ago, we were talking with some of your listeners about some of the physiological effects of spaceflight. For the most part, the physiological effects are reversible after, several months after you get back home. The psychological effects are not. My wife jokingly tells me that I've never returned to Earth from my last space flight. And what she's talking about are the psychological effects. Now I'm concerned about the big picture issues of society and humanity. The major problems today are, it's not, the affairs of the Kardashian family. The major problems today are poverty, inequality, overpopulation, environmental damage. It's so easy to see that from space. And so my wife has trouble, taking my mind away from these big thoughts and, helping me and getting me engaged again in family and household matters again, because I'm just, I've had that view of Earth from space. And like we said at the top of the show, we need tens of thousands, we need hundreds of thousands of people to fly in space regularly and see this, that we're all one humanity. We're not separate nations. We're not tribes. Nationalism is a horror that's being imposed on civilization today. And reality, we're an integrated civilization. The only way we can tackle some of these big problems that are out there right now, climate change is a classic example, is if we all come together. And this rhetoric, this geopolitical rhetoric that's out there right now, not helpful. We need, I do my best as an astronaut to try to, let people know that we need to come together and connect and collaborate. But we need more people who are sending out that message as well.
I cannot think of a better Star Trek message to have heard. I can't think of a better way to end our show. I got nothing after that. I can't thank you enough for spending time with us and sharing that great message with us. It's been a true honor and a pleasure. And I hope I get to cruise with you again someday.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Earl.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Mission Log Live is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Executive producer Rod Roddenberry. Technical production on Mission Log Live by Earl Green. Be sure to visit podcast.roddenberry.com for the latest from the Roddenberry Podcast Network. If you'd like to support Mission Log directly, that'd be cool. Patreon.com/missionlog is the place to do that. Thanks to everybody who joined us live or later, and we will talk to you next week.